January 17, 1945. Fort Clark, Texas. The wind came low across the flatlands that morning, dry and edged with cold, carrying the smell of mesquite and dust through the prisoner-of-war camp perimeter. Sunrise had not yet broken the horizon, but the sky already wore the pale bruise of dawn. In the distance, a horse whinnied, low, patient, waiting beside a wooden corral fence where frost still clung to the rails. The camp was waking slowly, a choreographed stillness punctuated only by the crunch of boots on gravel and the metallic clink of mess tins being stacked in the kitchen yards. It was then, in that narrow moment between night and day, that a German woman, prisoner 4477, recorded in the ledgers as Ilse Brenner, stumbled on the uneven ground near the eastern perimeter gate. Her hands, roughened by months of laundry work and fence repair, reached out instinctively to break her fall. But before her knees met the earth, a cowboy, one of the civilian contract workers employed by the U.S. Army to manage livestock and transport, dismounted in a single fluid motion and lifted her. Not roughly, not with the detached efficiency of a soldier handling cargo. He lifted her as though she were his sister, his daughter, someone worthy of gentleness. And then, without a word, he placed her onto the saddle of his horse. For 3 full seconds, the camp stopped breathing. The guards froze mid-stride. A group of German POWs hauling firewood turned their heads in unison, eyes wide, mouths slightly open. Even the crows perched along the barbed wire seemed to pause, black and still against the whitening sky. What had just occurred was not violent. It was not dramatic in the way battles are dramatic, but it was impossible. In the lexicon of war, of captors and captives, victors and vanquished, this gesture had no language. It existed outside the architecture of control, beyond the carefully maintained distance between enemy and ally, between prisoner and free man. And yet it had happened, right there, in front of everyone. Ilse Brenner sat motionless atop the horse, her spine rigid, her hands gripping the pommel as though it were the only solid thing left in the world. The cowboy, a man named Samuel Hewitt, 42 years old, owner of a small ranch outside Del Rio, stood beside the horse, one hand resting lightly on the animal's neck, his face calm, unremarkable. He did not smile. He did not perform. He simply waited, as men who work with animals know how to wait, until she steadied herself. Then he led the horse forward, walking beside it, toward the infirmary tent where her ankle could be examined. No one stopped him. No one spoke. And in that silence, something ancient and unspoken moved through the camp like a shift in air pressure before a storm. A recognition that what had just occurred was not merely an act of kindness, but a fissure in the ideological bedrock upon which the war itself had been constructed. To understand why this moment mattered, why it resonated, not only through Fort Clark, but through the carefully documented reports that would later circulate among Allied intelligence officers and, eventually, among the prisoners themselves as they returned to a shattered Germany. One must first understand what these women had been told to expect. By January 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. The Eastern Front had disintegrated into a chaotic retreat. The Western Front was crumbling under the weight of Allied offensives. German cities burned beneath waves of strategic bombing. And yet, even as the machinery of the Nazi state ground toward annihilation, its propaganda apparatus continued to function with remarkable efficiency. Ilse Brenner, like thousands of other German women conscripted into auxiliary military roles, Blitzmädchen, they were called Lightning Girls, had been fed a steady diet of apocalyptic messaging about what capture by American forces would mean. The Jews and the Bolsheviks have poisoned the Americans, the broadcast said. They will rape you. They will starve you. They will strip you of your humanity and reduce you to chattel. You are Aryan women. To them, you are both a prize and a threat. Expect no mercy. These were not fringe beliefs. They were institutionalized, woven into the fabric of daily briefings, repeated in the pages of military newspapers, reinforced by officers who themselves believed, or claimed to believe, in the existential stakes of racial conflict. For women like Ilse, born in 1921 in a small Bavarian town, educated in the Bund Deutscher Mädel, trained to see herself as a guardian of blood and soil, these warnings were not abstract. They were the framework through which she understood the world. And so, when she was captured in France in October 1944, along with a convoy of Wehrmacht support personnel retreating from the collapsing Ardennes salient, she expected the worst. She expected brutality. She expected the validation of everything she had been taught. What she found instead was Fort Clark. Fort Clark, Texas, was never meant to be a symbol. It was a practical solution to a logistical problem. By mid-1944, the United States held over 400,000 Axis POWs on American soil, the vast majority of them German. The influx was staggering, unprecedented. Camps sprouted across the southern and western states, Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, places far from the coasts, far from the industrial centers, where land was cheap and labor was scarce. The prisoners were put to work, harvesting cotton, cutting timber, repairing roads, sorting munitions. The labor was legal under the Geneva Conventions, and it was desperately needed. Fort Clark, originally a cavalry post established in 1852, had been deactivated as a military installation in 1944 and repurposed as a POW facility. It was remote, arid, surrounded by ranch land and mesquite scrub. The prisoners, mostly men but a small number of women in auxiliary units, lived in wooden barracks, ate from communal mess halls, and worked under the supervision of U.S. Army guards and civilian contractors. The conditions were, by the standards of wartime captivity, extraordinary. The prisoners received 3 meals a day. The caloric intake, as documented in War Department records, averaged 3,500 calories per person, more than many American civilians consumed during rationing. There was meat. There were vegetables. There was bread, real bread, baked fresh each morning in camp ovens. There was coffee, though it was often weak and bitter, and there was milk, rationed but reliable. The barracks were heated in winter and ventilated in summer. Medical care was provided by U.S. Army physicians. Recreational facilities included a library stocked with German-language books, a volleyball court, and a small theater where prisoners staged plays and musical performances. This was not accidental. It was policy. The United States had signed the Geneva Convention, and unlike Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, it intended to honor it, not out of sentimentality, but out of a calculated understanding that humane treatment of POWs served strategic purposes. It ensured reciprocal treatment of American prisoners. It undermined enemy propaganda. And, perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated to the world, and to the prisoners themselves, that democracy was not merely a slogan, but a system capable of restraining power, even in wartime. For the German prisoners, this was incomprehensible. They had been taught that democracy was weak, decadent, a system that prioritized comfort over discipline, individualism over collective strength. They had been told that America was a mongrel nation, divided by race and class, incapable of sustaining the willpower necessary for total war. And yet here they were, eating better than they had eaten in years, sleeping in beds with mattresses, receiving mail from home, working alongside civilians who treated them not as animals, but as laborers. Ilse Brenner would later describe, in interviews conducted by Allied psychologists in 1946, the cognitive dissonance of those first weeks. "I thought it was a trick," she said. "I thought they were fattening us up before the real cruelty began. I kept waiting for it. It never came. But food alone does not change a person. Comfort alone does not dismantle ideology. What changed Ilse, and what changed hundreds of German POWs like her, was not the material abundance, though that was startling. It was the accumulation of small, inexplicable acts of decency that had no place in the worldview she had carried across the Atlantic. The cowboy lifting her onto his horse was one such act, but it was not the first. There was the guard, Private First Class James Okonkwo, a black soldier from Georgia, who, in December 1944, had given Ilse his own wool blanket when hers had torn during a windstorm. She had stared at him, uncomprehending. She had been taught that black people were subhuman, a corrupting force in American society. And yet here was this man, offering her warmth without expectation, without ceremony. She had taken the blanket, and for 3 nights she had lain awake beneath it, trying to reconcile what she had been taught with what she had experienced. There was the camp doctor, Captain Morris Stein, a Jewish physician from Brooklyn who had treated her for pneumonia in late December. She had known he was Jewish. The other prisoners had whispered about it, half curious, half terrified. Ilse had expected, what? Vindictiveness? Cruelty. Instead, he had listened to her lungs with a stethoscope, prescribed sulfa drugs, and told her, in careful, accented German, to drink water and rest. "You will be fine," he had said. And she had been. There was the civilian contractor, a Mexican-American woman named Rosa Delgado, who supervised the camp laundry and who, one afternoon in January, had shared her lunch with Ilse when the mess delivery was delayed. Rosa had not asked for anything in return. She had not lectured. She had simply handed over half a sandwich, roast beef, thick and generous, and said, in broken German, "Eat. You look thin." These were not grand gestures. They were not recorded in official reports or celebrated in newspapers, but they accumulated one atop the other, like sediment building into rock, and slowly, imperceptibly, they began to erode the foundations of what Ilse had believed. The horse, Samuel Hewitt's horse, became, in the weeks following that January morning, a kind of talisman among the German prisoners. They spoke of it in low voices during work details, in the barracks at night, in the mess hall over plates of beans and cornbread. Not the horse itself, perhaps, but what it represented, the ease with which the cowboy had acted, the absence of hesitation, the implicit message that, in that moment, Ilse's well-being had mattered more than the boundaries of war. Horses, in the iconography of the American West, are symbols of freedom, mobility, autonomy. For German prisoners, many of whom had grown up in rural villages where horses were still working animals, the symbolism was not lost. But it was complicated by the fact that this horse, this particular animal, brown and unremarkable, with a white blaze on its forehead, had been used to elevate a prisoner, to literally lift her above the dust and place her in a position of care. In Nazi ideology, hierarchy was everything. The strong commanded, the weak obeyed. Victory conferred legitimacy, defeat conferred worthlessness. Prisoners, by definition, occupied the lowest rung. They had failed. They had been conquered. They deserved nothing. And yet here, in this American camp, that hierarchy was constantly, quietly subverted. Guards fraternized with prisoners during work breaks, sharing cigarettes and jokes. Civilians treated prisoners as laborers, not slaves, negotiating tasks and offering praise when work was done well. The food, always the food, arrived in quantities that spoke not of dominance, but of surplus, of a nation so wealthy it could afford to feed its enemies. This abundance was not incidental. It was structural. The United States, by 1945, had become the arsenal of democracy, its industrial capacity unmatched, its agricultural output staggering. While Europe starved, America overflowed. And this overflow extended even to the camps, where prisoners ate canned peaches and powdered milk, where Red Cross packages arrived with chocolate and cigarettes, where the mess halls served meals that, for many prisoners, were better than anything they had eaten before the war. Ilse Brenner, in her 1946 interview, described the first time she tasted American bread. "It was soft," she said. "Not the hard, dark bread we had in Germany. This was light, almost sweet. I thought it was cake. I asked if it was cake. They laughed and said no, it was just bread. Just bread." I cried that night, not because I was sad, but because I didn't understand how a country could be so rich and still be at war. The transformation was not immediate. Ideology does not collapse like a wall struck by a hammer. It erodes, piece by piece, under the patient pressure of contradictory evidence. For Ilse, the process took months. There were days when she clung to the old certainties, when she told herself that the Americans were simply biding their time, that the cruelty would come eventually. There were nights when she dreamed of home, of the Führer's voice on the radio, of marching in formation with the other girls, young and certain and unafraid. But those dreams grew thinner, less convincing, as the evidence mounted. In February, a group of prisoners organized a Valentine's Day concert in the camp theater. They performed Schubert Lieder, Beethoven piano sonatas, folk songs from Bavaria and Saxony. The guards attended. Some of them wept. After the concert, Captain Stein, the Jewish doctor, approached one of the pianists, a former Luftwaffe corporal, and told him in flawless German that his playing had reminded him of his grandfather, who had been a cantor in Berlin before the war. The corporal had stared at him speechless, as the weight of that statement settled over him like ash. In March, Samuel Hewitt returned to the camp with a gift, a photograph of Ilse sitting on his horse. Taken by another contractor on that January morning, he gave it to her without comment, without expectation. She held the photograph in her hands and looked at her own face, frozen in that moment of confusion and disbelief, and realized that she was looking at a stranger. The woman in the photograph was not the woman she had been when she arrived. That woman had believed in absolutes, in the rightness of her cause, in the inevitability of her enemy's cruelty. This woman sitting on a horse, held aloft by a cowboy who owed her nothing, was something else. She was beginning to doubt. By April, the war was over. Germany had surrendered. The camps filled with rumors. Cities in ruins. Millions dead. The full scope of the Holocaust emerging in photographs and testimonies that circulated among the prisoners like a virus. Ilse read the reports. She looked at the photographs, bodies stacked like cordwood, children with hollow eyes, gas chambers disguised as showers, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She had known, of course, that Jews were being persecuted. Everyone had known that. But this was something beyond persecution. This was extermination, industrial and methodical, carried out in her name, in the name of the ideology she had believed in, and she thought of Captain Stein, who had treated her pneumonia. She thought of Private Okonkwo, who had given her his blanket. She thought of Rosa Delgado, who had shared her sandwich. She thought of Samuel Hewitt, who had lifted her onto his horse. She thought of all the people who, by the logic of the Third Reich, should have been her inferiors, her enemies, her tormentors. And she realized that they had saved her. Not from physical harm, though perhaps from that too, but from something deeper. They had saved her from the prison of her own certainty. The symbol of the horse endured long after the war ended. In the years that followed, as German POWs were repatriated and began the slow, painful work of rebuilding their lives in a shattered nation, many of them carried with them the memory of small kindnesses, inexplicable generosities, moments when the rules of war had been quietly set aside. For Ilse, the horse became a touchstone, a way of explaining to herself and to others what had happened to her in America. She would say, in interviews and in letters written years later, that the moment Samuel Hewitt lifted her onto that horse was the moment she began to understand freedom. Not as an abstract concept, not as a slogan, but as a lived reality. Freedom, she came to believe, was not the absence of constraint. It was the presence of choice. It was the ability of a man to decide, in a single moment, that the rules did not apply. that mercy mattered more than hierarchy, that a stranger's dignity was worth defending even when no one was watching. This was the lesson of the camps, though it was a lesson many Germans struggled to accept. The United States, for all its flaws, and there were many, from the segregation of its own military to the internment of Japanese Americans, had demonstrated that power could be exercised with restraint, that abundance could be shared, that enemies could be treated as human beings without compromising security or discipline. It had demonstrated, in other words, that democracy was not weakness. It was a form of strength so profound that it could afford to be generous. Samuel Hewitt never spoke publicly about the incident. When asked years later by a local historian compiling oral histories of the war, he shrugged and said, "She fell. I helped her up. That's what you do." He did not see himself as a hero. He did not see the act as political. To him, it was simply common sense, the kind of thing any decent person would do. But Ilse saw it differently. In 1961, 16 years after the war ended, she traveled to Texas. She had married, had children, rebuilt her life in a Germany that was itself being rebuilt, brick by brick, from the ruins of totalitarianism. She went to Del Rio, found Samuel Hewitt's ranch, and knocked on his door. He was older, grayer, but he recognized her immediately. They sat on his porch, drank sweet tea, and talked for hours. She thanked him. He told her there was nothing to thank him for. She disagreed. Before she left, he took her to the barn and showed her the horse, now old, swayback, retired from work. She stood beside it, placed her hand on its neck, and felt the warmth of its skin, the slow rise and fall of its breath. And she wept, not from sadness, but from gratitude. Because this animal, this ordinary creature, had carried her across a threshold she had not known existed. It had carried her from certainty to doubt, from ideology to humility, from enmity to something that, if not quite friendship, was at least recognition. Recognition that the people she had been taught to hate were, in fact, people. Flawed, complicated, capable of both cruelty and kindness, but people nonetheless. The epilogue of this story is not tidy. History rarely is. Ilse Brenner lived until 1998, dying at the age of 77 in a small apartment in Munich. She spent much of her later life working with reconciliation organizations, speaking to young Germans about the dangers of ideology, the seductions of certainty, the importance of skepticism. She was not a saint. She did not claim to have atoned for her complicity in the Third Reich, but she did claim to have learned something. And that something, she said, began on a cold January morning in Texas, when a cowboy lifted her onto his horse and the camp stopped breathing. Samuel Hewitt died in 1979, at the age of 76, on the ranch where he had lived his entire life. His obituary in the Del Rio newspaper made no mention of the war, no mention of the camps, no mention of Ilse Brenner. It described him as a rancher, a father, a man who loved his land and his horses, which was true, but it was also incomplete. Because in one small, unremarkable act, he had done something extraordinary. He had reminded a prisoner of war, a woman who had been taught to see herself as superior and her captors as inferior, that kindness does not require permission, that decency does not depend on ideology, and that humanity, when given the chance, will almost always choose compassion over cruelty. This is the larger truth that the moment at Fort Clark embodies, that freedom is not merely the absence of oppression, but the presence of the possibility for grace, that abundance is not just material wealth, but the surplus of empathy that allows a society to extend dignity even to its enemies, that democracy, for all its inefficiencies and compromises, creates space for individuals to act according to their conscience, to defy the logic of war, to lift a stranger onto a horse and, in doing so, to affirm the simple, radical proposition that every person, every single person, matters. The horse is long dead. The camp is long closed, its barracks torn down, its grounds returned to ranchland. But the memory endures, passed down in letters and interviews, in the quiet testimony of those who witnessed it and those who learned from it. It endures because it speaks to something essential, something that no amount of propaganda or ideology can fully extinguish. The recognition that, in the end, we are all human. And that recognition, once sparked, can change everything. The wind still comes low across the flatlands of Texas, carrying the smell of mesquite and dust. The sunrise still breaks over the horizon, pale and bruised and beautiful. And somewhere in the space between memory and history, a cowboy lifts a German woman onto his horse, and the camp stops breathing. And the world, just for a moment, remembers what it means to be kind.